The execution was scheduled for dawn, but Sarah had no intention of waiting for the sunrise to claim her life. The silver chains binding her wrists burned against her skin, not from the metal itself, but from the suppressants they had soaked the bindings in, designed to keep Omegas compliant and powerless. But Sarah had learned long ago that power came in forms the Alphas never bothered to recognize. She had been counting the guards' rotation patterns for 3 days, memorizing the exact moment when the night watch changed and a precious 40 seconds of chaos allowed for the impossible. The symbols on her arms, those cursed marks that had sentenced her to death, began to glow faintly in the darkness of her cell, responding to something she could not yet name, but had always felt thrumming beneath her skin like a second heartbeat. King Cale Thornwood signed her death warrant without hesitation, his powerful hand moving across the parchment with the same cold efficiency he applied to every decision that maintained his iron grip on the Northern Territories. The council had presented him with ancient texts, prophecies written in blood and ash that spoke of an Omega bearing the marks of the old gods, an Omega whose very existence would bring about the fall of the Alpha bloodlines and the destruction of their carefully constructed hierarchy. Cale had built his reputation on decisive action and unwavering strength. Sentiment was a weakness he could not afford, especially not for a cursed Omega whose death would secure the future of his kingdom. He told himself it was justice, told himself it was necessary, told himself he felt nothing as he sealed her fate. But that night, as he stood on the balcony of his fortress overlooking the execution grounds, something unfamiliar twisted in his chest when he thought of the Omega's eyes, those defiant silver eyes that had met his gaze during her trial without fear, without pleading, with only a quiet acceptance that somehow felt like an accusation. The escape was messier than Sarah had planned. The guard who discovered her missing chains raised the alarm too quickly, and suddenly the entire fortress was alive with howls and the thunder of Alpha warriors transforming to give chase. Sarah ran with everything she had, her bare feet bleeding on the frozen ground as she pushed toward the one place she knew they would not follow, the forbidden forest that marked the edge of the known world. The elders spoke of it in whispers, a place where the old magic still lived, where the spirits of the first werewolves walked between the trees, and madness claimed any who dared trespass on sacred ground. But madness seemed preferable to the executioner's blade, and as Sarah crashed through the tree line, something ancient and vast turned its attention toward her. The pursuing warriors skidded to a halt at the forest's edge, their courage failing them as an unnatural silence fell over the woods. Even their wolves, those primal aspects of their nature, whined and refused to take another step forward. Kyle arrived at the forest boundary within the hour, his fury at his guards' incompetence radiating from him in waves that made even his most seasoned warriors step back. He had never failed to complete a hunt, never allowed a target to escape his reach, and he was not about to let a half-dead Omega be the first. The fact that she had managed to break free from chains that should have been unbreakable gnawed at him, suggesting that perhaps the prophecies held more truth than he wanted to acknowledge. His beta, Marcus, a grizzled warrior who had served 3 generations of Thornwood kings, cautioned him against entering the forest. The stories were not mere superstition, Marcus insisted. Alphas who had entered those woods in generations past had either never returned or had emerged days later, broken and babbling about judgments and ancient voices that peeled back their minds layer by layer. But Cale's pride would not allow retreat. He would enter alone, he decided, unwilling to risk his warriors, but unable to abandon the hunt. His wolf surged forward, confident and powerful, the apex predator that had never known defeat. The forest swallowed him whole. One moment, Cale stood at the tree line, Marcus's worried voice calling after him, and the next he was surrounded by towering ancient trees, whose branches formed a canopy so thick that neither moonlight nor starlight penetrated. The temperature dropped so suddenly that his breath misted in the air despite the summer warmth he had left behind. His wolf, usually a constant presence in his mind, fell silent for the first time in his life, and the absence was terrifying in a way he had never experienced. Cale had always drawn strength from his alpha nature, from the raw power that made him king, but here, in this place that existed outside the natural order. He was simply a man walking through the domain of something far older and infinitely more powerful than any werewolf bloodline. The spirits made their presence known slowly, whispers at first, in languages he did not recognize, but somehow understood at a level deeper than conscious thought. They spoke of balance and blood debt, of kings who took more than they gave, of a reckoning that had been building for centuries, while alphas grew fat on their own superiority. Sarah collapsed against a massive oak tree, her lungs burning and her body trembling from exhaustion and the lingering effects of the suppressants. She expected the king's warriors to burst through the trees at any moment, expected to die here in the darkness with no one to mourn her passing. Instead, she felt warmth spreading through her body, originating from the marks on her skin that now glowed with brilliant silver light. The whispers came next, gentle and welcoming, calling her daughter, and chosen, and long awaited. Figures began to materialize from the mist that rose from the forest floor. Not solid, but not quite transparent either. Beings that existed between states, between life and death, between the mortal world and something beyond. They were beautiful and terrible, bearing the features of wolves, but standing upright, crowned with antlers and adorned with symbols that matched those carved into Sarah's flesh. The first ones, her mind supplied, though she had no memory of learning that name. The original werewolves, before the bloodlines split and hierarchies formed, before alphas claimed. Dominion and omegas were reduced to property and breeding stock. The eldest of the spirits, a massive female with eyes like molten gold, knelt before Sarah and placed a translucent hand against her cheek. The touch sent visions flooding through Sarah's mind, thousands of years of history compressed into moments of overwhelming sensation. She saw the first werewolves living in harmony, saw the emergence of the alpha bloodlines and their gradual corruption by power, saw the systematic suppression of omega abilities because the alphas feared what they could not control. The marks on her skin were not a curse but a birthright, the sign of the first omega bloodline, the original balance keepers who possessed the ability to amplify or nullify werewolf power, to heal or harm, to build or destroy. The alphas had spent centuries hunting down and eliminating anyone who bore these marks, rewriting history to erase any record of omega power, creating the lie that omegas were weak and helpless so that no one would question their subjugation. Sarah was the first to survive to adulthood in 300 years, hidden by her mother's sacrifice and protected by clever deception, until the marks manifested fully on her 18th birthday, and her secret could no longer be contained. If you are enjoying this journey into the hidden truths of the werewolf world, please like this video and let me know in the comments what you think about Sarah's discovery of her true heritage. Kyle wandered the forest. For what felt like hours, his sense of direction completely compromised by the shifting landscape that seemed to rearrange itself with every turn. He called out for the Omega, his voice echoing strangely in the oppressive silence, more out of frustration than any real hope of finding her. When the spirits finally revealed themselves to him, he reached for his alpha power instinctively, preparing to dominate and control as he had done his entire life. But his power, that overwhelming force that could bring any werewolf to their knees, simply dissipated like smoke in a strong wind. The spirits laughed, not cruelly, but with a sadness that was somehow worse, as if they had seen this arrogance 1,000 times before and knew exactly how it would end. They spoke to him of his bloodline, of the first Thornwood king who had been a just and fair leader, and of each successive generation that had grown more corrupt, more cruel, more convinced of their own superiority until they became the very monsters they claimed to protect their people from. The spirit who approached Kale bore the features of his own ancestor, a king from 6 generations past, whose portrait hung in the throne room and whose name was spoken with reverence. But this spirit's eyes held only disappointment as he looked upon his descendant. The ancestor spoke of choices and consequences, of how power wielded without compassion always turned to tyranny, of how Kale had sentenced innocents to death for crimes they did not commit simply to maintain control through fear. The Omega girl he had marked for execution was not the threat the corrupted prophecies claimed. She was the solution to a problem Kale did not even know existed, a darkness that had been feeding on the werewolf kingdom for generations, growing stronger with every act of cruelty and injustice. The prophecy had been deliberately mistranslated by Kale's own grandfather, who had recognized the marks on an Omega child decades ago and understood that her power could unseat the alpha dominance. Rather than face the truth that the hierarchy was unsustainable and unjust, the grandfather had rewritten the prophecy to make Omegas like her appear as harbingers of doom, ensuring that any who bore the marks would be eliminated before they could challenge the established order. Sarah stood on shaking legs, supported by the spirits whose presence filled her with strength she had never known. They showed her how to access the power that had been dormant within her, how to feel the threads of energy that connected all werewolves, how to sense the corruption that had woven itself through the kingdom like poison in the bloodstream. There was a darkness, they explained, an entity that fed on suffering and subjugation, that had attached itself to the Thornwood line generations ago, and had been influencing each king toward greater cruelty. It whispered in their dreams, inflamed their worst impulses, convinced them that brutality was strength, and that anyone who challenged their authority deserved only death. The entity was growing stronger, approaching a point where it would no longer need to hide behind manipulation, but could manifest fully and consume the entire werewolf world. Only someone with the first Omega bloodline could sever the entity's connection and purify the corrupted power structures, but it would require cooperation from the Alpha King himself, a willingness to submit to the Omega's power in a complete reversal of everything their society claimed was natural and right. The spirits brought Kale to Sarah, depositing him in the clearing where she stood surrounded by ethereal guardians whose very presence made his instincts scream warnings his rational mind could no longer ignore. She looked different than she had in the throne room, no longer the broken and defeated prisoner awaiting execution. Her marks blazed with silver fire. Her eyes reflected that same luminescence, and she stood with the bearing of someone who had finally understood their own worth. Kale's first impulse was anger, rage at being humiliated and rendered powerless in front of the creature he had deemed unworthy of life. But the spirit's revelations echoed in his mind, and for the first time in his adult life, Kale felt something he had never allowed himself to experience. Shame. He had ordered the death of an innocent, had perpetuated a system of oppression that served only to feed a parasitic darkness, had become exactly the kind of monster that true leaders were supposed to protect their people from. Sarah looked at the king who had condemned her, this powerful alpha now stripped of his power and forced to see her as she truly was, rather than as the convenient victim his corrupted beliefs required her to be. She felt the spirit's expectation that she would forgive him, would extend grace to someone who had shown her none, and the anger that surged through her was righteous and burning. He had signed her death warrant without even speaking to her, without questioning the propaganda his grandfather had fed him, without considering that perhaps the stories he had been told about Omega weakness and Alpha supremacy were lies designed to maintain an unjust hierarchy. The spirits whispered that vengeance would only feed the darkness, that true strength lay in breaking cycles rather than perpetuating them. But Sarah was not interested in being strong if strength meant swallowing her anger and pretending his actions had not scarred her soul. She had spent her entire life being told to be grateful for whatever scraps of kindness alphas deigned to show her, to accept abuse as her natural lot, to suppress her own pain to avoid inconveniencing those with power. She was done performing that particular submission. Kale dropped to his knees, not from compulsion, but from the crushing weight of genuine guilt. He had always justified his harshness as necessary for maintaining order, had told himself that individual suffering was acceptable if it served the greater good of stability, but stability built on oppression was not order, it was controlled chaos, and the entity feeding on that suffering had been using him as a puppet to create the exact conditions it needed to fully manifest. Looking at Sarah now, seeing the evidence of her true power and the nobility the spirits treated her with, Kale understood that he had been lied to his entire life. Everything he believed about Alpha superiority and Omega inferiority was propaganda, carefully constructed myths. designed to justify cruelty and maintain a system that benefited a few at the expense of many. The most damning realization was that part of him had always known, had always felt the wrongness of the hierarchy, but had chosen comfort and power over truth and justice. The spirits explained the task before them with grave solemnity. The entity had anchored itself to the Thornwood bloodline through a ritual performed by Kael's grandfather, binding its essence to the crown itself and ensuring that each successive king would be more susceptible to its influence. To break the connection, Sarah would need to use her first Omega abilities to purify the crown. But the process required the current king to willingly submit to her power, to open himself completely to her influence, and accept whatever changes that might bring. For an Alpha to submit to an Omega in such a fundamental way violated every instinct and cultural norm their society had built. It would require Kael to trust Sarah with his very essence, to make himself vulnerable in a way that Alphas were taught was the ultimate weakness. Refusal was always an option. The spirits made clear. Kael could leave the forest, return to his kingdom, and continue his reign. But the entity would continue to grow stronger, and within a generation or two, there would be nothing left of the werewolf world but suffering and shadow. Subscribe to this channel if you want to see more stories that explore the hidden costs of power and the difficult path to genuine redemption. Sarah wanted to refuse, wanted to tell the spirits to find another way that did not require her to save the man who had tried to kill her. But she had seen the visions they showed her, had witnessed the futures that awaited if the entity was not stopped. Countless Omegas suffering and dying, children born into slavery, entire packs consumed by the darkness that fed on cruelty. Her anger was justified. Her pain was real, but allowing that pain to prevent her from acting would make her complicit in future suffering. She could hate Kael and still recognize that he was currently the only Alpha with enough power, even diminished as it was in this sacred space, to complete the ritual. The spirits assured her that she would have complete control during the process, that if Kael showed any sign of betrayal or attempted to use the connection to harm her, she could sever it immediately and his mind would shatter. From the backlash, it was cold comfort, but it was enough to make her consider the possibility. Kael agreed to the ritual without hesitation, a decision that surprised both Sarah and himself. Perhaps it was the shame that had taken root in his chest, or perhaps it was the exhaustion of carrying the weight of maintaining a lie he no longer believed in. He told Sarah he did not expect her forgiveness, did not deserve her grace, but that if his submission could undo even a fraction of the harm his bloodline had caused, then it was the least he owed. The spirits prepared the space, drawing symbols in the air that glowed with ancient power, creating a circle that would contain the ritual and protect them both from the entity's attempts to interfere. Sarah stood at the center, her marks burning brighter than ever, while Kael knelt before her and bowed his head in a posture of complete surrender. When she placed her hands on either side of his face, the connection between them opened like a floodgate, and suddenly she was drowning in everything he was, everything he had been, everything he had done. The experience was overwhelming and intimate in a way that transcended physical contact. Sarah felt every moment of Kael's life, every choice and consequence, every time he had chosen cruelty over kindness, because it seemed stronger, seemed safer. She felt his fear, the terror of a young prince who learned that showing compassion was punished while brutality was rewarded, who had been systematically taught to suppress his empathy until it withered into something barely recognizable. She felt the entity's presence, a sickening wrongness that had been whispering in his mind for so long that he had mistaken its voice for his own thoughts. But she also felt the core of who Kael had been before the corruption, a child who had cried when he saw Omega servants beaten, who had questioned why some wolves were deemed more worthy than others, who had wanted to be a good king before he learned that goodness was considered weakness. Kael experienced the ritual from the other side, feeling Sarah's power move through him like cleansing fire. It burned away the entity's influence, severing connections he had not known existed, purifying corrupted channels of power that had been feeding the darkness for generations. But more than that, he felt her pain, experienced her memories of every humiliation and abuse she had endured in a society that taught her she was worthless. He felt her terror as she awaited execution, her despair at being condemned by someone who never bothered to see her as a person worthy of consideration. The shame he had felt before was nothing compared to this, experiencing firsthand the consequences of his actions and the actions of his bloodline. He wanted to pull away, wanted to escape the crushing weight of that empathy, but he had promised complete submission, and he would not break that promise even as it destroyed everything he thought he knew about himself. The crown appeared between them, materializing in the space where their energies merged, and Sarah could see the entity's hooks embedded deep into the metal, pulsing with malevolent hunger. She gathered her power, drawing on the strength of the first ones who stood witness, and began the process of extraction. The entity fought back, screaming in rage at being torn from its host, attempting to flee deeper into Cale's mind or transfer itself to Sarah. But the ritual's protections held, and Sarah's power was too pure, too fundamentally opposed to the entity's corruption for it to find purchase in her essence. With a final wrenching pull that left both her and Cale gasping, Sarah tore the entity free and cast it into the void between worlds where the spirits assured her it would dissipate slowly. Starved of the suffering it needed to maintain form, the crown fell to the ground between them, now just metal and jewels, its power broken and its corruption purged. They remained connected. For long moments after the entity was gone, neither quite ready to sever the bond that had formed through such profound intimacy, Cale felt fundamentally changed, as if every certainty he had built his identity upon had been dismantled, and now he had to figure out who he was, without the lies that had shaped him. Sarah felt exhausted, but also oddly at peace, as if a weight she had carried her entire life had finally been lifted, when they finally broke the connection and stepped back from each other. The forest seemed lighter somehow. The oppressive darkness that had hung over everything now dispersed. The spirits bowed to them both, to Sarah for fulfilling her bloodline's purpose, and to Cale for having the courage to change even when change meant destroying everything he had been. The journey back to the kingdom took 3 days, during which Cale and Sarah barely spoke beyond the necessities of travel. There was too much to process, too many revelations to integrate, and the easy camaraderie that sometimes formed between people who had shared traumatic experiences eluded them. Sarah still carried her anger like armor, unwilling to let her guard down around someone who had tried to kill her, regardless of the reasons or the forces that had influenced him. Cale struggled with the knowledge of who he had been, and the uncertain path to becoming someone better, someone worthy of the power he still technically held even if it felt hollow now. The spirits had made clear that the ritual had only removed the entity's direct influence. The corrupt systems it had helped establish, the unjust laws and brutal traditions, those were still in place and would require deliberate effort to dismantle. Their arrival at the fortress caused immediate chaos. The guards did not know whether to apprehend Sarah or protect their king, and Cale's disheveled appearance and obvious deference to the Omega they all knew he had condemned raised more questions than anyone seemed prepared to answer. Marcus met them at the gates, his weathered face creased with concern and confusion, as he took in the sight of his king, walking beside the escaped prisoner, as if they were equals. Cale called for an emergency council meeting, his voice carrying the weight of command, even though everything else about his demeanor suggested profound uncertainty. He needed to tell them everything, needed to expose the lies that had shaped their kingdom, needed to begin the process of dismantling the hierarchy, even though he knew it would cost him everything he had ever valued. The council meeting was brutal. The assembled alphas, all-powerful wolves who had benefited enormously from the existing hierarchy, reacted with predictable outrage when Cale began explaining what he had learned in the Forbidden Forest. They accused him of being compromised, suggested that the Omega had somehow corrupted his mind, demanded that she be executed immediately before she could spread her poison further. Cale felt his old instincts rising, the urge to assert his dominance and force their obedience. But that was the entity's way, the path that had led to centuries of suffering. Instead, he did something no Thornwood King had ever done. He asked Sarah to speak, to tell them in her own words what the spirits had revealed, and what she had experienced during the ritual. Sarah had never addressed a council of alphas before, had never been permitted to speak in the presence of her betters, and the fear that rose in her throat was instinctive and overwhelming. But she looked at the marks on her arms, felt the lingering presence of the First One's power, and found her voice. She told them everything, speaking with a clarity and passion that came from years of suppressed truth, finally finding expression. She detailed the true history of their kind, exposed the deliberate suppression of Omega abilities, explained how the entity had been feeding on their cruelty and growing stronger with each generation. Some of the alphas listened with dawning horror, while others grew more entrenched in their denial, unable to accept that their entire worldview was built on lies. The eldest council member, a wizened alpha who had served under 4 kings, finally broke the tense silence by asking the question that mattered most. What did they do now? Kale presented his plan for systematic reform, changes that would dismantle the hierarchy and establish true equality among all werewolves regardless of their designation. Omegas would have full legal rights. The practice of forced bonding would be abolished. Omega children would receive the same education and opportunities as alphas, and the laws that made Omega's property would be struck from the books entirely. He proposed a new council structure that included Omega and Beta representatives, ensuring that no single designation could dominate the others. The alphas who had profited most from the old system protested vehemently, and Kale knew. He was looking at the beginning of a civil war. Some would never accept these changes voluntarily, would fight to maintain their power and privilege even if it meant destroying the kingdom. But for the first time in his life, Kale was prepared to fight for something that mattered more than his own authority. The resistance came quickly and violently. 3 prominent alpha families attempted a coup within the week, gathering their warriors and marching on the fortress with demands that Kale step down, and that the Omega witch who had corrupted him be burned for treason. Kale met them on the battlefield with warriors loyal to the new vision, wolves who had seen the truth in Sarah's words and recognized that the old ways had been slowly killing them all. The battle was fierce and costly, and Kale found himself fighting not with the brutal efficiency he had been taught, but with a desperate desire to minimize casualties, to preserve life even among those who sought to destroy everything he was trying to build. It was Sarah who turned the tide, using her first Omega abilities to dampen the aggressive instincts that the entity had amplified, allowing reason to penetrate the battle fury that had consumed both sides. Comment below what you think about Sarah's use of her power to stop the violence, and whether you believe Kale's reforms can actually succeed in changing such a deeply entrenched system. The aftermath of the battle forced a reckoning that the kingdom could no longer avoid. With proof of Sarah's power and the undeniable change in their king, even the most resistant alphas had to acknowledge that something fundamental had shifted. Kale offered amnesty to those who would accept the reforms, exile to those who could not, but made clear that the old ways were done regardless of how many chose to fight. It was a hard line that cost him allies and strained relationships that had once seemed unbreakable. But the spirits had taught him that meaningful change always required sacrifice, and he was finally willing to pay that price. The process of actually implementing the reforms was slow and frustrating, meeting resistance at every level from alphas who found 1,000 ways to delay and obstruct. But gradually, incrementally, things began to change. Sarah found herself in the strange position of being both savior and symbol, lifted up by some as proof that Omegas possessed power and worth, while others blamed her for destroying the stability they had known. She was not interested in being anyone's martyr or icon. She simply wanted to help build a world where no Omega child would grow up believing they were worthless. She worked alongside former Omega slaves to establish education programs, to create shelters for those fleeing abusive alphas, to train other Omegas in accessing abilities that had been suppressed for generations. It was exhausting work that yielded slow progress, and there were days when the weight of it all felt crushing. But then she would see an Omega child reading for the first time, or watch a bonded Omega legally dissolve a forced bond, and she remembered why it mattered. The relationship between Sarah and Kyle remained complicated and undefined, existing in the space between enemies and allies, where trust was fragile and forgiveness felt impossible. The ritual had created a bond between them that neither fully understood, an awareness of each other's emotional states that occasionally flared into overwhelming intensity. Kale felt her pain and anger like his own, experienced her memories of suffering as an ongoing accusation that he could never fully answer. Sarah felt his genuine remorse and his desperate attempts to change. But she also remembered the cold certainty in his eyes when he signed her death warrant, and that memory made vulnerability feel like stupidity. They worked together because the work demanded it, because the reforms required both her credibility with Omegas and his authority over Alphas. But working together did not mean trusting each other or pretending the past had not happened. The breakthrough came 6 months into the reform process, during a crisis that threatened to unravel everything they had built. A group of Alpha extremists kidnapped several Omega children from one of Sarah's new schools, demanding a return to the old laws and threatening to kill the children if their demands were not met. Kyle wanted to send his warriors in with overwhelming force to crush the rebellion and make an example that would discourage future resistance. But Sarah argued for a different approach, for using her abilities to dampen the extremists' aggression and create space for negotiation. They fought bitterly about strategy, each convinced their approach was right, until Kale finally admitted what was really driving his desire for violent resolution: fear that he was not strong enough to protect the kingdom without brutality, that if he showed mercy, he would be perceived as weak and everything would fall apart. Sarah saw him then, really saw him, not as the tyrant who had condemned her, but as someone struggling desperately to be better, while terrified that better was not enough. She told him about her own fears, about feeling like an imposter who had no idea how to wield the power she possessed, about worrying that every decision she made would result in someone else's suffering. The honesty created a fragile connection that felt different from the forced intimacy of the ritual, something chosen rather than imposed by necessity. They developed a plan together, combining his strategic knowledge with her unique abilities. And when they confronted the extremists, they did so as genuine partners, rather than reluctant allies. Sarah's power dampened the violent impulses while Kyle offered the extremists a choice: accept exile or accept the reforms. But the killing ended today. The children were returned safely, and for the first time, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe the kingdom could actually change. The following month saw a gradual shift in their dynamic, from forced cooperation to something that resembled friendship, though neither would have labeled it that. They fell into rhythms of working together, of seeking each other's counsel on difficult decisions, of finding comfort in someone who understood the weight of trying to fix a broken system. Kyle began to rely on Sarah's insight in ways that had nothing to do with her Omega abilities, valuing her perspective and intelligence in their own right. Sarah started to see past the king who had condemned her to the complicated man underneath, someone capable of growth, even if that growth was painful and incomplete. The anger that had sustained her began to transmute into something more nuanced, an acknowledgement that people could be both the worst thing they had ever done and more than that single act. The romantic tension that had been building between them came to a head during a late-night strategy session when exhaustion lowered their usual guards and proximity made denial impossible. Kyle confessed that the ritual bond had left him unable to see her as anything other than the most important person in his life, that somewhere between hating what he had been and trying to become someone better, he had fallen completely and hopelessly in love with her. Sarah's response was complicated, because she felt the pull of that bond too. Felt something that might have been love if it was not so tangled up with hurt and history. She told him that she could not separate her feelings for who he was becoming from her memories of who he had been. That every time she considered trusting him, she remembered the moment he signed her death warrant without hesitation. Kale accepted her honesty without defensiveness, told her he would wait as long as she needed or forever if that was what it took. That his feelings did not obligate her to anything. That acceptance, that willingness to want her without demanding she perform the forgiveness he hoped for, was what finally began to crack Sarah's defensive walls. She started noticing small things about him, the way he listened to Omega petitioners with genuine interest, The nightmares that woke him thrashing and calling out apologies to people long dead. The way he pushed himself past exhaustion, trying to earn a redemption he knew he might never deserve. She saw him advocate for policies that weakened his own power, that made him vulnerable to challenge, because strengthening Omega rights mattered more than maintaining his authority. He was not the same person who had condemned her, had done the hard work of changing not because it was easy, but because it was right. And Sarah found herself wanting to acknowledge that growth, even as it terrified her. Their first kiss happened not in a moment of high drama, but in a quiet instant of shared understanding, after a particularly difficult council session where they had successfully pushed through legislation that made forced bonding a criminal offense. They stood together on the balcony where Kyle had once watched the execution grounds being prepared for Sarah, and the symbolism was not lost on either of them. He told her he was sorry, not for the first time, but with a depth of feeling that made clear he would never stop being sorry, would carry that guilt for the rest of his life. She told him she was learning to live with both the pain of what he had done and the possibility that people could change enough to deserve another chance. That forgiveness was not forgetting but choosing not to let the past define every moment of the future. When she kissed him, it was with full awareness of the risk she was taking, choosing vulnerability, even when vulnerability had hurt her so deeply before. The kingdom's reaction to their relationship ranged from celebration to scandal, depending on who was asked. Some saw it as proof that the reforms were working, that alphas and omegas could meet as equals and build something genuine. Others viewed it as confirmation that Sarah had seduced and corrupted their king, that she was using her omega wiles to manipulate him into destroying the natural order. The controversy made everything more difficult, made every policy decision into a referendum on their relationship, but it also solidified something between them. A shared determination to prove that love built on mutual respect and genuine equality was not only possible but worth fighting for. They established clear boundaries between their personal relationship and their professional responsibilities, refusing to let detractors claim that Sarah's influence was inappropriate or that Cale had lost his ability to lead independently. Subscribe if you are invested in seeing how Sarah and Cale navigate building a new world while building a relationship on the ruins of the past. The true test came when Sarah discovered she was pregnant, a development that sent shockwaves through a kingdom still adjusting to the idea of omegas having agency. The old laws would have made the child property of the alpha father, but the new reforms meant Sarah had full rights over decisions about the pregnancy and how any resulting child would be raised. The conservative faction saw the pregnancy as an opportunity to pressure for a traditional bonding ceremony, arguing that an unmarried omega bearing the king's child was scandalous and undermined the moral authority of the crown. But Sarah refused to be forced into anything, refused to let her pregnancy become leverage to push her into a bond she might not want. Kyle supported her completely, publicly stating that any bond between them would happen only if and when Sarah decided she wanted it, that his child would be legitimate and recognized regardless of their bonding status. The pregnancy also raised uncomfortable questions about genetics and power, about what abilities a child born of both royal alpha bloodline and first omega heritage might possess. Sarah's abilities had already been challenging enough for the kingdom to accept. A child who potentially combined alpha and omega gifts in ways never before seen was terrifying to many who still clung to the comfort of designated roles and predictable power structures. There were whispered suggestions that the child should be monitored, controlled, perhaps even bound with suppressants from birth to prevent any dangerous manifestation of power. Sarah shut down those suggestions with cold fury, making clear that her child would be raised free from the fear and suppression that had defined her own childhood, that anyone who attempted to harm or control her baby would face the full force of her abilities with no mercy given. The assassination attempt came when Sarah was 7 months pregnant, a coordinated attack by extremists who believed that killing her and the unborn child would allow the kingdom to return to the old ways. She was visiting one of the Omega schools when armed wolves breached the building, and for several terrifying minutes, it seemed the resistance might succeed where Cale's original execution order had failed. But Sarah's abilities had grown stronger during pregnancy, heightened by the protective instincts of impending motherhood. and she dropped the attackers with a pulse of power that left them unconscious but alive. Kyle arrived minutes later, having felt her terror through their bond, and the expression on his face as he gathered her into his arms, made clear that anyone who threatened her would face his wrath, regardless of his commitment to mercy and reform. The failed assassination forced a final confrontation with the remaining extremist faction. Kale declared martial law and gave the resistors a choice: accept the reforms and integrate into the new society, or face exile beyond the kingdom's borders. Those who chose exile left with bitter promises that they would return someday to restore the natural order, but Kale let them go rather than executing them for treason. Sarah appreciated his restraint, but also worried that mercy shown to those who refused to change might come back to haunt them. He told her that he would rather risk future conflict than become the tyrant he had been, that the moment they started executing people for their beliefs rather than their actions was the moment they lost the moral high ground that justified the reforms in the first place, the birth of their daughter. 3 months later was a moment of profound significance that transcended personal joy. The baby girl arrived healthy and howling, bearing silver marks that matched her mother's and golden eyes that echoed her father's alpha heritage, a living symbol of what their world could become when it rejected artificial divisions. They named her Alara, meaning light bringer in the old language, and the name felt prophetic when her mere presence seemed to calm the tensions that had plagued the kingdom. Omegas who had been afraid to hope saw in Alara proof that their children might grow up in a truly different world. Alphas who had resisted change found it harder to justify the old prejudices when confronted with the undeniable power and beauty of this child who embodied both designations. Sarah and Kyle formally bonded 6 months after Alara's birth, but it was a ceremony entirely of their own design, rejecting the traditional rituals that emphasized alpha dominance and omega submission. They stood as equals before the assembled kingdom, each speaking vows that emphasized partnership and mutual respect, each bearing marks that symbolized their choice rather than any obligation or hierarchy. The bonding created a deeper connection than the ritual had forged, something chosen freely rather than imposed by necessity. And through that connection they could feel each other's emotions, could communicate without words, could draw on each other's strength when their own faltered. It was not the magical solution to every problem, but it was a foundation they could build on, a commitment to face whatever challenges came together. The years that followed brought both triumphs and setbacks. Some regions embraced the reforms wholeheartedly, becoming models of the equality and cooperation that Sarah and Kyle envisioned. Other regions clung stubbornly to the old ways, requiring constant oversight and intervention to prevent backsliding into oppression. Sarah established a network of first Omega bloodline holders, other wolves who had hidden their marks and abilities all their lives, now coming forward to be trained and to help with the ongoing work of dismantling corrupt power structures. Kale restructured the military to include Omegas in leadership positions, to value strategic thinking and compassion as much as raw strength, creating a force that protected rather than dominated. Alara grew into a fierce and curious child who seemed to understand instinctively that her existence was political, that she represented possibilities people had fought and died to make real. She asked difficult questions about why things had been the way they were, about why her mother had nearly been killed, about whether her father was a good person or a bad person who was trying to be good. Sarah and Kale answered honestly, believing that their daughter deserved to know the truth, rather than a sanitized version that protected adult egos. They told her that people were complicated, that her father had done terrible things, but was working every day to do better, that forgiveness was a process rather than a moment, and that sometimes the most important thing was choosing to move forward while still honoring the pain of the past. The 10th anniversary of the reforms brought celebration and reflection, a moment to acknowledge how far they had come and how far they still needed to go. The kingdom that had once built its foundation on hierarchy and oppression was slowly transforming into something more egalitarian, more just, though the work was far from complete. Sarah and Kyle stood together during the anniversary ceremony, older and scarred by the battles they had fought, but still committed to the vision that had brought them together. They spoke to the assembled crowds about the ongoing nature of change, about how creating a better world required constant effort rather than a single decisive moment, about how every generation would have to choose whether to continue the work or slide back into old patterns. That night, alone in their quarters with Alara asleep nearby, Sarah told Kyle something she had never quite articulated before, that she had forgiven him, not because he deserved it, or because she had forgotten what he had done, but because holding on to that pain was preventing her from fully embracing the life they were building together. Forgiveness did not mean the past did not matter, or that the scars had disappeared, but it meant choosing not to let those scars define every interaction, choosing to see him as the person he was becoming, rather than only the person he had been. Kyle wept, something the old version of himself would never have allowed, and told her that her forgiveness was a gift he would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of. The future remained uncertain, as futures always are. But as Sarah stood on the balcony looking out over the kingdom, she felt something she had never expected to experience: hope. The world she had been born into had told her she was worthless, had tried to kill her for the crime of existing, but she had survived and had helped transform that world into something better. There would be more battles to fight, more resistance to overcome, more setbacks and frustrations that would test their resolve. But for the first time, Sarah believed that the arc of their world was bending toward justice, slowly and imperfectly, but genuinely, and that belief made every struggle worthwhile. She felt Kyle's presence behind her, felt his arms wrap around her, and the bond between them pulse with shared contentment. And she knew that whatever challenges came, they would face them together. Two people who had every reason to hate each other but who had chosen love instead, building a future on the ruins of the past and daring to believe that redemption was possible for kingdoms as well as kings.